In the emerald hills of Ireland, beneath the morning mist and ancient stone circles, there lurks a truth so dark and twisted that centuries of sanitized storytelling have buried it beneath layers of commercial fantasy and childhood whimsy. You think you know the Leprechaun. You've seen the cereal boxes, the greeting cards, the jolly little green man with his pot of gold and his mischievous grin. But what if I told you that this cheerful mascot is nothing more than the grotesque shadow of something far more sinister? What if the real Leprechaun was never meant to make you smile, but to make you tremble? This is not the story they tell you on St. Patrick's Day. This is not the tale of lucky charms and rainbow's end. This is the story of cultural violence, of ancient gods torn from their thrones and twisted into caricatures. This is the story of how one of Europe's most sophisticated mythologies was systematically destroyed, degraded, and repackaged as harmless folklore to serve the interests of colonizers and commercialists. Tonight, we journey into the true heart of Irish darkness, where the Leprechaun reveals himself not as a friend, but as a warning about what happens when a people's gods are stolen, their stories rewritten, and their sacred truths transformed into profitable lies. The year was somewhere around the 8th century. The scribes in their stone monasteries were busy recording the old tales, their quills scratching across parchment as they tried to capture the fading echoes of a world that Christianity was rapidly erasing. In one of these ancient texts, a story emerged that would chill the blood of anyone who truly understood its implications. It was called the Ectra Fergus mac Leti, the adventure of Fergus, son of Leti, and it contained the first recorded encounter with creatures that would one day become the leprechauns of sanitized folklore. But these were not the harmless cobblers of later imagination. These were the Leprechaun, and they were monsters. King Fergus of Ulster had fallen asleep on a beach, exhausted from his royal duties, vulnerable in the way that only sleep can make a man. But his rest was not peaceful. As he lay unconscious on the sand, 3 small figures emerged from the churning waters of the sea. They were not there to grant wishes or offer pots of gold. They were there to kill. The Leprechaun began dragging the sleeping king toward the waves, their supernatural strength far exceeding what their diminutive size should have allowed. This was no playful prank. This was an attempted murder, a supernatural assassination carried out by beings whose very nature was antithetical to human life. They intended to drown the king in the depths of the ocean, to claim his life as payment for some ancient grudge or cosmic balance that mortals could never fully comprehend. Fergus awoke just in time, his warrior instincts saving him from a watery grave. But rather than fleeing these otherworldly attackers, he did something that would echo through centuries of folklore. He captured them. He overpowered these supernatural beings and bound them with chains that they could not break, even with their otherworldly abilities. Only then, faced with captivity, did the Leprechaun reveal their true nature. They were not mere water sprites or mischievous fairies. They were creatures of immense power, capable of granting wishes that could reshape reality itself. They offered King Fergus 3 wishes in exchange for their freedom, wishes that could grant him dominion over land and sea, wishes that could make him the most powerful ruler in all of Ireland. This medieval tale reveals something profound and disturbing about the true nature of leprechaun mythology. These were never benevolent gift-givers. They were predators, beings whose default interaction with humanity was violence and deception. The gold they offered, the wishes they granted, these were not gestures of kindness. They were the desperate bribes of captured monsters, supernatural creatures trying to buy their freedom from human captivity. But why were these ancient texts so specific about their murderous intent? Why did the monks who recorded these stories feel compelled to preserve tales of creatures who tried to drag kings to their deaths? The answer lies in understanding what these beings truly represented in the pre-Christian Irish worldview. They were not characters in children's stories. They were manifestations of the untamed, hostile forces of nature itself. The very name Leprechaun tells us everything we need to know about their original conception. It derives from the ancient Irish words meaning small body, but this diminutive size was not meant to suggest harmlessness. In the Celtic understanding of the supernatural, physical size had no correlation to spiritual power. These small bodies contained vast and dangerous energies, concentrated malevolence that could destroy human lives with casual ease. The linguistic evolution of their name across the centuries reveals a pattern of systematic cultural degradation that should disturb anyone who understands what it represents. In Ulster, they were called Leprechaun. In Connacht, Leprechaun. In Leinster, Leprechaun. In Munster, Lurgadan. Each region of Ireland had its own specific term for these beings, each variation carrying subtle differences in meaning and cultural context. This fragmentation wasn't accidental. It reflected the complex network of local supernatural beliefs that existed before Ireland was unified under Christian rule. Each community, each tribe, each sacred grove had its own understanding of these dangerous spirits. Some saw them as water demons, others as earth elementals, still others as the vengeful spirits of the ancient dead. But as Christianity spread across the island, something terrible began to happen to these regional variations. They began to merge, to simplify, to lose their specific cultural contexts. The rich tapestry of local supernatural knowledge was being woven into a single, standardized narrative that could be more easily controlled and eventually dismissed by religious authorities. This process of cultural homogenization was not organic, it was deliberate. The Christian scribes who recorded these tales were not neutral observers preserving ancient wisdom. They were active participants in a project of cultural transformation that would ultimately serve the interests of colonial powers. They were taking the sacred stories of a conquered people and rewriting them as curiosities, as entertaining but ultimately harmless folklore. The most disturbing aspect of this transformation becomes clear when we examine what these creatures originally represented in the deeper layers of Irish mythology. The Leprechaun were not independent supernatural beings operating outside the established pantheon of Celtic gods. They were directly connected to some of the most powerful and revered deities in the Irish spiritual tradition. At the heart of this connection lies one of the most tragic stories in the history of European mythology. The ancient Irish solar god Lugh, master of all arts and crafts, divine king of the Tuatha De Danann, the shining lord whose festival of Lugnasad celebrated the first harvest of the year. Lugh was not a minor deity or folkloric curiosity. He was one of the central figures in the Irish pantheon, a god whose worship extended across the Celtic world and whose influence shaped the spiritual lives of countless generations. But as Christianity gained dominance in Ireland, Lugh's fate became a template for the systematic destruction of native spirituality. He could not simply be erased from cultural memory. Too many people knew his stories, honored his festivals, and looked to him for protection and guidance. Instead, he had to be transformed, diminished, made safe for the new religious order. The process began subtly. Lugh, the magnificent solar deity, became Lugh Cromain, stooping Lugh, a figure relegated to the underground realm of the Seed, where all the old gods were being systematically banished. No longer a master of the heavens, he became a denizen of hollow hills and secret places, his divine radiance dimmed to a faint glimmer in the darkness beneath the earth. From there, the degradation accelerated. Lugh Cromain became the Leprechaun, then the Leprechaun, and finally the Leprechaun. Each linguistic shift represented another step away from divine majesty and toward folkloric triviality. The god who once commanded the movements of the sun became a solitary craftsman, hammering away at a single shoe, his infinite creative powers reduced to endless, futile labor. This transformation was not metaphorical. It was literal cultural murder. The leprechaun that emerged from this process bore no resemblance to the mighty Lugh who had once ruled over light itself. Instead of a radiant god whose very presence could banish darkness, the world was left with a hunched, ugly little creature whose greatest achievement was cobbling shoes that would never be worn. But Lugh was not alone in this systematic degradation. The leprechaun's true origins reach even deeper into the mythological bedrock of Ireland, connecting these diminished beings to the Tuatha De Danann themselves, the legendary race of gods who once ruled the Emerald Isle with wisdom and supernatural power. These were not the fairy folk of later sanitized stories. They were the divine pantheon of ancient Ireland, beings of such immense spiritual authority that their very names could shake mountains and command the seas. According to the oldest Irish traditions, the Tuatha De Danann were the children of the mother goddess Danu, divine beings who brought 4 magical treasures to Ireland when they first arrived from the other world: the sword of Nuada that could never be drawn in vain, the spear of Lugh that never missed its target, the cauldron of the Dagda that could feed any number without ever emptying, and the stone of Fal that would cry out when touched by a rightful king. These were gods in the truest sense, wielders of cosmic forces who shaped the very landscape of Ireland through their divine will. They were master magicians, skilled warriors, wise rulers, and patron deities of every craft known to human civilization. When they walked the earth, the harvests were bountiful, the seasons flowed in perfect harmony, and the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of infinite possibility grew thin enough for miracles to pass through. But even gods can be conquered, and the arrival of the Milesians, the ancestors of the modern Irish people, marked the beginning of the end for the Tuatha De Danann's earthly reign. In a series of epic battles that shook the foundations of reality itself, the divine race was defeated and forced to retreat from the surface world. They became the Aes the people of the Hollow Hills, dwelling in an underground realm where their diminished power could no longer threaten the new order. This mythological defeat foreshadowed a far more devastating conquest that would come centuries later. When Christianity arrived in Ireland, followed by wave after wave of foreign invaders, the same pattern repeated itself on a cultural level. The native gods were not destroyed outright, for that would have been impossible. Instead, they were systematically diminished, transformed from objects of worship into subjects of folklore, from sources of spiritual power into entertainment for children. The leprechaun represents the final stage of this cultural genocide. What had once been Lugh, the radiant solar deity, master of all crafts, divine king of the gods themselves, was now a grotesque little creature whose appearance alone spoke volumes about the violence that had been done to Irish spiritual tradition. The traditional descriptions of leprechauns in authentic folklore are almost painful to read when you understand what they truly represent. These creatures were not the jolly, mischievous figures of modern imagination. They were described as old, wrinkled, and profoundly ugly, with faces like dried apples and expressions of permanent sourness. Their stunted bodies and gnarled features were not accidents of artistic imagination. They were the physical manifestation of cultural trauma, the way a conquered people's sacred stories looked after centuries of systematic degradation and foreign influence. The leprechaun's famous ill temper, his querulous nature and foul mouth, these were not personality quirks designed to make folklore more colourful. They were the rage of dethroned gods, the fury of divine beings who had been stripped of their celestial authority and reduced to comic relief in the stories of their own descendants. Every curse they uttered was a lament for their lost majesty. Every trick they played was a desperate attempt to reclaim some fragment of their former power. Even more disturbing was their transformation into solitary beings. The Tuatha De Danann had been a community of gods, a divine society that reflected the interconnected nature of all existence. They had kings and queens, warriors and craftsmen, musicians and judges, all working together in perfect harmony to maintain the cosmic order. But the leprechaun was alone, forever hammering away at a single shoe, cut off from the divine fellowship that had once given his existence meaning and purpose. This enforced isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the transformation. It reflected the way that colonization and cultural conversion had shattered the organic communities of pre-Christian Ireland, replacing them with hierarchical structures that served foreign interests rather than native needs. The leprechaun's endless, solitary labor became a metaphor for the condition of the Irish people themselves under colonial rule, working tirelessly at tasks that would never bring them prosperity or fulfillment. But the degradation did not stop with appearance and temperament. Even the leprechaun's most famous attribute, his association with hidden gold, was a twisted echo of his divine origins. Lugh had been the god of prosperity and abundance, the divine patron whose favor brought wealth to entire kingdoms. His festivals celebrated the harvest, the moment when the earth's hidden treasures were revealed and shared with the community. The leprechaun's pot of gold was the pathetic remnant of this cosmic generosity. Instead of blessing entire peoples with abundance, he hoarded his treasure in secret places, guarding it jealously from human contact. Instead of freely sharing the earth's bounty as Lugh had done, he became a miser whose gold could only be obtained through trickery and coercion. This transformation from generous god to stingy hoarder was not accidental. It reflected the economic realities of colonial Ireland, where the native population was systematically impoverished while their resources were extracted for the benefit of foreign masters. The leprechaun's hidden gold became a fantasy of sudden wealth that could never actually materialize, a cruel joke played on a people who had been robbed of their ancestral prosperity. The transformation of the leprechaun's relationship with treasure reveals an even darker truth about the systematic destruction of Irish spiritual traditions. In the authentic folklore of Ireland, these beings were not generous dispensers of wealth to lucky humans. They were misers of the most vicious kind, creatures whose relationship with gold had been perverted into something that reflected the economic violence inflicted upon the Irish people themselves. When a mortal encountered a leprechaun in the old stories, the interaction was never pleasant. These creatures had to be physically captured, bound, and threatened before they would reveal the location of their hoards. They would fight viciously against their captors, using every trick and deception at their disposal to avoid parting with even a single coin. And even when forced to comply, they would lead their human captors on elaborate wild goose chases, disappearing the moment attention wavered, leaving behind nothing but empty holes and broken promises. This behavior was not the playful mischief of benevolent tricksters. It was the desperate resistance of beings who had been stripped of everything except their ability to withhold the one thing humans desired most. The leprechaun's relationship with gold had become a twisted mirror of Ireland's relationship with its colonial masters, where wealth existed but could never be accessed, where prosperity was always just out of reach, hidden behind barriers of violence and deception. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of leprechaun lore was not what these creatures did, but what they represented in the collective unconscious of a traumatized people. Their very existence spoke to deep psychological wounds that had been inflicted on Irish culture, wounds that continued to fester long after the original violence had been forgotten by conscious memory. The leprechaun's famous association with shoemaking, seemingly innocent enough, carried profound symbolic weight when understood in its proper context. These creatures were always described as working on a single shoe, never completing a pair, never finishing their labor. This endless, futile toil was not a quirky character trait designed to make folklore more memorable. It was a metaphor for the condition of the Irish people under colonial rule, condemned to perpetual labor that could never lead to completion or satisfaction. The sound of their hammering, which could allegedly be heard echoing through the hills and valleys of Ireland, became the soundtrack of a conquered people's despair. Every strike of the hammer was a reminder that meaningful work had been replaced by meaningless drudgery, that the creative energies that had once built a sophisticated civilization were now channeled into tasks that served no purpose except to keep the workers occupied and powerless. Even more disturbing was the leprechaun's traditional attire, which varied significantly across different regions of Ireland, but always carried undertones of military conflict and social disruption. In Ulster, these creatures were described wearing military red coats and pointed hats, their appearance evoking the foreign soldiers who had conquered their homeland. In Tipperary, they sported slashed jackets and carried swords that they used as magic wands, their weapons transformed into tools of powerless illusion. These martial elements in leprechaun descriptions were not accidental. They reflected the traumatic memory of countless invasions, occupations, and cultural suppressions that had shaped Irish history. The leprechaun became a repository for all the violence that could not be spoken about directly, a folkloric container for the rage and grief of a people who had been systematically disarmed, both literally and culturally. The regional variations in leprechaun appearance also revealed how deeply the trauma of conquest had penetrated into local communities. Each area of Ireland had developed its own specific vision of these creatures, each reflecting the particular forms of violence and disruption that had affected their corner of the island. The fat, jolly leprechaun of Kerry, with his 7 rows of 7 buttons, was a different kind of cultural wound than the tall, changeable far Darrig of other regions, whose practical jokes could turn lethal without warning. This diversity of traumatic expression showed how the degradation of Irish culture had been both systematic and intensely local, affecting each community in ways that were simultaneously universal and deeply specific. The leprechaun became a shapeshifter, not through magical power, but through the different ways that different communities processed their collective trauma. But the most sinister aspect of leprechaun mythology was its complete absence of female representatives. In authentic Irish folklore, there were no female leprechauns, no mothers or wives or daughters among these diminished divine beings. This gender void was not an oversight or a simple quirk of storytelling tradition. It represented something far more disturbing about the nature of cultural destruction and the specific ways that colonization targeted indigenous spiritual systems. The ancient Irish pantheon had been remarkably balanced in its representation of divine feminine and masculine principles. Goddesses like Brigid, the Morrigan, and Danu herself held positions of supreme spiritual authority, their worship forming the cornerstone of pre-Christian Irish religious to subordinate roles, but was recognized as the fundamental creative force that gave practice. The feminine divine was not relegate birth to all existence. When Christianity began its systematic replacement of native Irish spirituality, one of its primary targets was this powerful feminine divine presence. The new religion, with its male godhead and its deep suspicion of feminine spiritual authority, could not tolerate the continued worship of goddesses who challenged its theological assumptions. These powerful female deities had to be eliminated from cultural memory more completely than their male counterparts. The absence of female leprechauns represented the success of this spiritual genocide. While male gods like Lugh could be degraded and transformed into folkloric curiosities, the goddesses were subjected to even more thorough erasure. They could not be allowed to survive even in diminished form, for their very existence would have reminded people of alternative ways of understanding divine power and spiritual authority. This gendered aspect of cultural destruction had profound implications for Irish society as a whole. By eliminating the feminine divine from folkloric memory, the colonizing forces ensured that traditional Irish concepts of gender balance and feminine spiritual authority would be lost along with everything else. The leprechaun became not just a degraded god, but a symbol of a spirituality that had been artificially constrained to exclude half of human experience. The implications of this spiritual castration extended far beyond mythology into the lived reality of Irish cultural identity. Without the feminine divine to provide balance and completeness, Irish folklore became a wounded, incomplete system that could never fully nourish the spiritual needs of the people it was supposed to serve. The leprechaun's eternal bachelorhood was not just a storytelling convention, but a reflection of a culture that had been systematically prevented from reproducing itself in healthy, balanced ways. As the centuries passed, and Ireland experienced wave after wave of conquest, occupation, and cultural suppression, the leprechaun evolved to reflect each new layer of trauma. The arrival of Anglo-Norman invaders added new elements to the folklore. The Protestant Reformation brought fresh forms of religious persecution. The catastrophic famines and mass emigrations of the 19th century left their own scars on the collective imagination. Each historical trauma was absorbed into leprechaun mythology, transforming these already degraded beings into ever more distorted reflections of Irish suffering. Their appearance became uglier, their temperament more sour, their behavior more antisocial. They evolved from diminished gods into active symbols of cultural pathology, creatures whose very existence testified to the psychological damage inflicted on an entire civilization. By the time leprechauns reached the attention of Anglo-Irish writers and British folklorists in the 18th and 19th centuries, they had become perfect vehicles for expressing and reinforcing anti-Irish prejudices. These foreign observers saw in leprechaun folklore exactly what they expected to see: confirmation of their preconceived notions about Irish character and intelligence. The creature's ugliness, bad temper, and antisocial behavior seemed to validate stereotypes about Irish people being primitive, violent, and fundamentally inferior to their British neighbours. This colonial interpretation of leprechaun mythology became the foundation for all subsequent commercial and popular representations of these beings. The leprechaun was no longer even a degraded memory of ancient gods, but had become a weapon in the ongoing project of cultural domination, a folkloric justification for continued oppression and exploitation. The transformation was now complete. What had begun as Lu, the radiant solar deity, master of all arts and sciences, divine king of the gods themselves, had become a cartoon character designed to sell breakfast cereal and justify ethnic prejudice. The leprechaun had evolved from sacred mythology through folkloric trauma to become commercial propaganda, each stage of its degradation serving the interests of those who had conquered and continued to exploit Irish culture. But even in this debased form, the leprechaun retained traces of its original power, fragments of divine authority that could not be completely erased, no matter how thoroughly the surrounding culture was suppressed. These remnants of authentic spiritual tradition would prove to be more dangerous to the colonial project than anyone could have anticipated, for they carried within them the seeds of cultural resurrection and the promise of eventual vengeance against those who had presumed to murder gods and transform them into mascots. The true horror of what had been done to leprechaun mythology became most visible when these creatures crossed the Atlantic Ocean alongside the waves of Irish immigrants fleeing famine and persecution in their homeland. But what arrived in America was not authentic Irish folklore. It was already a twice-wounded mythology, first degraded by centuries of colonial suppression, and then filtered through the prejudiced lens of British folklorists who had never understood or respected the spiritual traditions they claimed to document. In the immigrant communities of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, leprechaun stories took on new and even more disturbing characteristics. These were not the complex, regionally specific beings of authentic Irish tradition, but simplified caricatures designed to serve the psychological needs of a displaced and traumatized population. The leprechaun became a symbol of the old country, but an old country that had never actually existed, except in the imagination of people desperate to maintain some connection to a homeland they could never return to. American leprechaun folklore developed its own pathological characteristics, reflecting the specific traumas of immigration and cultural displacement. These creatures became more violent, more unpredictable, more fundamentally hostile to human contact. They were no longer the degraded remnants of ancient gods, but active symbols of cultural alienation and psychological fragmentation. The Irish-American leprechaun was a creature caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither the authentic traditions of Ireland nor the emerging culture of America. This liminal existence drove them to acts of increasing desperation and malevolence, as if they understood instinctively that their very existence depended on maintaining a connection to spiritual traditions that were rapidly dissolving in the melting pot of American assimilation. But it was the response of mainstream American culture to these immigrant folklore traditions that revealed the full scope of the violence being done to leprechaun mythology. Rather than approaching these stories with respect or curiosity, American writers, artists, and eventually advertisers saw in the leprechaun an opportunity to express and reinforce their own prejudices against Irish immigrants. The timing was perfect for this cultural assault. Irish immigrants arrived in America during a period of intense nativism and ethnic hostility, when established populations viewed newcomers as threats to their economic security and cultural dominance. The leprechaun provided a convenient vehicle for channeling these anxieties into seemingly harmless folklore, allowing anti-Irish sentiment to be expressed through children's stories and commercial imagery rather than direct political persecution. American leprechaun imagery drew heavily on the same visual vocabulary that had been used in British anti-Irish propaganda for centuries. The creatures were depicted with exaggerated facial features that echoed the simian caricatures published in magazines like Punch, suggesting that Irish people were somehow less evolved than their Anglo-Saxon neighbours. Their clothing was deliberately shabby and outdated, reinforcing stereotypes about Irish poverty and cultural backwardness. Most insidiously, American leprechauns were consistently portrayed as violent and unpredictable, prone to sudden fits of rage that could turn deadly without warning. This characterization served to justify the discriminatory treatment of Irish immigrants in employment, housing, and social situations, suggesting that their apparent friendliness masked an inherent tendency toward criminality and violence. The phrase "fighting Irish" became inextricably linked to leprechaun imagery, creating a false equivalence between authentic Irish cultural pride and the pathological aggression attributed to these folkloric creatures. This linguistic sleight of hand allowed discrimination to be packaged as cultural celebration, turning Irish identity itself into a form of entertainment for non-Irish audiences. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of American leprechaun commercialization was its impact on Irish-American communities themselves. Faced with constant discrimination and pressure to assimilate, many Irish immigrants and their descendants began to internalize the stereotypes being projected onto their folklore. They started to see leprechauns not as degraded remnants of their ancestral spiritual traditions, but as harmless symbols of ethnic pride that could be safely displayed without threatening their acceptance in American society. This internalization of colonial stereotypes represented a form of cultural suicide, a voluntary abandonment of authentic tradition in favor of commercialized caricature. Irish-American communities began celebrating St. Patrick's Day with parades featuring giant leprechaun floats, leprechaun costumes, and leprechaun decorations that bore no resemblance to anything found in genuine Irish folklore, but perfectly matched the expectations of mainstream American culture. The leprechaun became a cultural bridge that led nowhere, a symbol that connected Irish Americans not to their authentic heritage, but to a fantasy version of Irishness that had been designed by their oppressors. This false connection was worse than no connection at all, for it provided the illusion of cultural continuity, while actually severing the last threads that bound these communities to their spiritual and mythological roots. The commercial exploitation of leprechaun imagery reached its logical conclusion in the 20th century with the emergence of mass media and consumer capitalism. These creatures became mascots for everything from breakfast cereals to sports teams, their ancient divine origins completely forgotten in favor of their utility as marketing tools. The leprechaun's pot of gold became a metaphor for consumer desire, his trickster nature reinterpreted as the playful deception of advertising. Each commercial use of leprechaun imagery drove another nail into the coffin of authentic Irish spiritual tradition. The creatures appeared on cereal boxes, grinning maniacally as they promoted sugar-laden products to children. They danced across television screens, hawking beer and potato chips to audiences who had no understanding of the cultural violence they were witnessing. They became the faces of casinos and lottery systems, their association with luck and hidden treasure transformed into an engine for extracting wealth from vulnerable populations. This commercial leprechaun bore no resemblance whatsoever to the Leprechaun who had once tried to drown King Fergus, or the degraded remnants of Lugh who hammered endlessly at their single shoes in the hills of Ireland. It was a completely artificial creation, designed not to preserve or honor Irish culture, but to exploit whatever commercial value could be extracted from its corpse. The most perverse aspect of this commercialization was its global reach. Leprechaun imagery spread far beyond Ireland and Irish-American communities to become a universal symbol of a certain kind of whimsical folklore. Children in countries that had never experienced Irish immigration learned to associate leprechauns with luck and gold and harmless mischief, completely unaware that they were participating in the final stages of a centuries-long campaign of cultural genocide. And so we reach the end of our journey into the true heart of leprechaun mythology, where the cheerful mascot reveals himself as the grotesque remnant of murdered gods, and the sanitized folklore strips away to expose the raw wounds of cultural annihilation. The leprechaun stands before us now, not as a symbol of Irish whimsy, but as a monument to one of history's most successful campaigns of spiritual genocide, a testament to what happens when a people's sacred stories are stolen, twisted, and sold back to them as entertainment. The next time you see that grinning green figure on a cereal box or a greeting card, remember what you have learned. Remember Lugh, the radiant solar deity who once commanded the movements of the sun itself. Remember the Tuatha De Danann, the divine race whose very names could shake mountains and part seas. Remember the Leprechaun, who tried to drown kings in the dark waters of ancient Ireland, creatures of such power that even in their diminished state they could grant wishes that reshaped reality itself. Remember that folklore is never just entertainment. It is the living memory of a people, the repository of their deepest truths and most sacred wisdom. And when that folklore is corrupted, commercialized, and transformed into propaganda, something far more precious than stories dies. The very soul of a culture withers, leaving behind only the hollow shell of authentic tradition, dressed up in the garish costume of consumer capitalism. The leprechaun's journey from god to monster to mascot is not unique to Irish culture. Across the world, the same pattern repeats itself wherever indigenous traditions encounter colonial power and commercial exploitation. Sacred beings are reduced to cartoon characters, profound spiritual truths become advertising slogans, and the wisdom of countless generations is packaged and sold as harmless entertainment for children. But perhaps there is hope, even in this darkness. Perhaps by understanding what was truly lost, by recognizing the violence that transformed gods into mascots, we can begin the long work of cultural healing. Perhaps we can learn to see through the sanitized surface of modern folklore to the authentic traditions that still pulse beneath, waiting for someone brave enough to listen to their true voice. The leprechaun story is far from over. Somewhere in the misty hills of Ireland, in the forgotten corners of immigrant neighborhoods, in the dreams of those who still remember what their ancestors knew, the old stories wait. They wait for someone to strip away the layers of commercial paint and colonial propaganda, to dig down through the sediment of centuries until they reach the bedrock of authentic tradition. They wait for someone to remember that folklore is not decoration, but revelation, not entertainment, but truth. They wait for someone to understand that the leprechaun was never meant to make us smile, but to make us remember what we have lost and what we might yet reclaim. The gods may have been dethroned, but they are not dead. They live on in the stories, twisted and diminished, but still carrying traces of their original power. And sometimes, in the right light, at the right moment, Those who know how to look can still catch glimpses of what they once were and what they might become again. So remember the leprechaun, not as the world wants you to remember him, but as he truly was and might yet be again. Remember him as a warning about the price of cultural surrender and as a promise of eventual resurrection. For in the end, no amount of commercial exploitation can completely destroy the truth that lives at the heart of authentic tradition. The leprechaun endures, not as a mascot, but as a monument to the resilience of the human spirit and the stubborn persistence of sacred truth. He reminds us that even gods can be murdered, but they cannot be forgotten. And sometimes, just sometimes, the dead rise again.